The courtroom was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence as Julia Carson, a seasoned attorney known for her tenacity, rose to address the judge. The air was thick with tension. The recent plane crash had claimed dozens of lives, including that of Robert Delaney, the CEO of the aviation giant Skyward Airlines. Julia had been hired to represent the bereaved families, who were seeking justice for their loved ones. She was determined to hold Skyward accountable, suspecting negligence and possible cover-ups in the wake of the disaster. As she presented her opening statement, Julia felt the weight of the task ahead. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today not just to seek compensation for the unimaginable loss suffered by these families, but to uncover the truth, she began, her voice steady and clear. We believe that Skyward Airlines failed in its duty to ensure the safety of its passengers, and we intend to prove that this tragic accident was preventable. In the back of the courtroom, Richard Hunter, the high-powered attorney for Skyward Airlines, listened with a calm, almost indifferent demeanor. He had a reputation for being ruthless, known for his ability to twist facts and dismantle the opposition's arguments with ease. Beside him sat Victor Carlisle, the interim CEO of Skyward, a man with a calculating gaze and a disarming smile that rarely reached his eyes. As the trial proceeded, Julia meticulously presented evidence and witness testimonies, each piece painting a picture of a company that had prioritized profits over safety. A former engineer testified about ignored maintenance issues and pressure from higher-ups to cut costs. A whistleblower from within the company revealed documents showing how safety protocols were routinely bypassed. During a recess, Julia sat in the courthouse cafeteria, reviewing her notes. Her mind was racing, not just with the facts of the case, but with the implications of what she was uncovering. Her assistant, Mark, a sharp and resourceful paralegal, joined her. He placed a fresh stack of documents on the table. These just came in, Mark said, a hint of excitement in his voice. Internal emails from Skyward's top executives. They discuss a known issue with the model of the aircraft that crashed. They knew, Julia. Julia scanned the documents, her expression hardening. This could be the smoking gun, she muttered. But we need to verify these emails and their authenticity. If they are real, it means Skyward knowingly endangered the lives of their passengers. Mark nodded. I'll get on it right away. Also, I've noticed something odd about Victor Carlisle. He seems unusually calm, like he knows something we don't. Julia looked up, intrigued. Keep an eye on him. We need to be prepared for anything. Skyward won't go down without a fight, and neither will Carlisle. As the trial resumed, Julia continued to press forward, exposing more of Skyward's internal failures. The company's legal team, led by Richard Hunter, countered aggressively, trying to discredit witnesses and downplay the significance of the evidence. The tension between Julia and Richard was palpable, a clash of two formidable legal minds. Then, in a surprising turn of events, Julia received an anonymous tip. A former pilot from Skyward, who had fled the country after being pressured to keep quiet, was willing to testify. The pilot, now living in hiding, claimed to have direct knowledge of Skyward's negligence and the company's efforts to cover up crucial information. Julia arranged a video testimony, her heart pounding with anticipation. The pilot's face appeared on the screen, visibly nervous but determined. He recounted instances where he had been instructed to ignore safety warnings and continue flying planes that were not fully inspected. Skyward knew about the faulty sensors in the aircraft. They were cutting corners to save money, the pilot stated, his voice shaky but clear. I was told to keep quiet, or I'd lose my job. When I pushed back, they threatened my family. I had no choice but to leave. The courtroom was stunned into silence. This was the break Julia needed, but she knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. She had to connect this testimony with the internal emails and the patterns of negligence she had uncovered. The pilot's words, though damning, were just one part of a much larger puzzle. As Julia prepared for the next day in court, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Victor Carlisle's calm demeanor, the aggressive tactics of Skyward's legal team, and the sudden appearance of the anonymous tip all pointed to a deeper, more sinister plot. Julia was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. That night, as she pored over documents in her office, the phone rang. Julia hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was low and measured. Ms. Carson, I think you should know, your investigation has stirred up some powerful enemies. Be careful. Not everyone wants the truth to come out. The line went dead, leaving Julia with a growing sense of unease. She looked around her office, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. The stakes had never been higher, and as she faced off against Skyward Airlines, she knew she was up against not just a corporation, but a powerful network of individuals with a lot to lose. Julia resolved to press on, her determination hardening into resolve. She had to see this through, for the victims, for their families, and for the truth. But she also knew she had to protect herself and her team. The battle was just beginning, and Julia Carson was ready to fight. As the trial progressed, Julia Carson's pursuit of the truth about Skyward Airlines became increasingly perilous. The courtroom battles were fierce, with Skyward's legal team, led by Richard Hunter, using every tactic in the book to discredit Julia's witnesses and undermine her case. The judge, an experienced jurist named Judge Marlowe, maintained a stern but fair demeanor, carefully considering the arguments from both sides. Outside the courtroom, Julia's investigation into Skyward's practices deepened. The anonymous tip and the testimony from the former pilot had shaken the company's defenses. Still, Julia knew she needed more concrete evidence to secure a win. She focused on the internal emails Mark had uncovered, which hinted at a cover-up involving the faulty sensors that contributed to the crash. Julia and Mark worked late into the night, piecing together the timeline of events leading up to the accident. These emails show a clear pattern, Julia noted, pointing to one in particular from Victor Carlisle, sent weeks before the crash. They were aware of the issues and chose to ignore them. Mark leaned over the table, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. It's not just ignorance, Julia. It's deliberate. They knew about the risks and decided it was cheaper to risk lives than to fix the problems. Julia nodded, feeling the weight of their discovery. We need to prove this in court. If we can link these decisions directly to the accident, we have a case for gross negligence. The next day, Julia presented the new evidence to Judge Marlowe, requesting a subpoena for additional internal documents from Skyward. Richard Hunter objected vehemently, arguing that the request was a fishing expedition. However, the judge, intrigued by the implications of the emails, granted Julia's request. Skyward's legal team was visibly unsettled. Victor Carlisle, who had maintained a calm facade throughout the trial, now seemed tense. He leaned over to Richard, whispering urgently. Julia watched them closely, sensing a shift in the air. The subpoena could uncover more incriminating evidence, and Skyward knew it. As the trial adjourned for the day, Julia received a call from her husband, David. "Julia, are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine, David," she reassured him, though she wasn't entirely sure. The anonymous call still lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. "Just busy with the case." David sighed. "I know this is important, but be careful. I worry about you." Julia smiled, touched by his concern. "I will. I promise." That evening, as she drove home, Julia noticed a black SUV following her. Her heart raced, and she took a few unexpected turns, testing if the vehicle would follow. It did. Julia's mind raced through her options. She decided to head to the nearest police station, hoping the sight of law enforcement would deter whoever was tailing her. As she pulled into the station's parking lot, the SUV sped away. Julia took a moment to catch her breath, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a clear warning. She quickly made her way inside and reported the incident. The officers took her statement seriously and promised to increase patrols around her home and office. The next morning, Julia received a package at her office. Inside was a note typed on plain paper: "Drop the case, or there will be consequences." There was no signature, but the message was clear. Julia's determination hardened. She wouldn't be intimidated into silence. She immediately contacted the police, who began an investigation into the threat. Julia also arranged for private security to protect her family, especially her young daughter, Emily. The threats had made one thing clear: she was getting too close to the truth, and someone was desperate to stop her. Meanwhile, the court-mandated documents began to arrive. Among them was a report detailing the financial impact of recalling the faulty sensors and fixing the aircraft. The report explicitly stated that the cost of a recall would be significantly higher than potential legal payouts from accidents. It was a damning piece of evidence that pointed to a corporate decision to prioritize profits over safety. Julia presented the report in court, her voice steady but charged with emotion. This document shows that Skyward Airlines knew about the dangers and made a calculated decision to risk the lives of its passengers. This is not just negligence, this is a gross disregard for human life. Richard Hunter objected, claiming the document was taken out of context, but the damage was done. The jury looked visibly shaken, and even Judge Marlowe seemed disturbed. Victor Carlisle, for the first time, appeared genuinely worried. As the day ended, Julia knew they were getting closer to the truth. But with each step forward, the threats became more menacing. Her phone rang late that night. It was the anonymous caller again. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Carson. Drop the case, or you won't just be risking your career, you'll be risking your life." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She looked around her office, feeling the walls close in. The stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't back down now. Not when justice was within reach. As she hung up, Julia knew she had to protect herself and her family. The battle was intensifying, and Skyward's desperation was palpable. The truth was there, just beneath the surface, and Julia Carson was determined to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Julia Carson arrived at the courthouse with a renewed sense of urgency and determination. The threats against her and her family had escalated, making it clear that she was up against powerful forces willing to go to any lengths to stop her. Yet, these threats only fueled her resolve. As she walked through the marble halls, the eyes of the public and media followed her, sensing the gravity of the case. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The latest batch of documents had revealed not just negligence but a deliberate cover-up orchestrated by Skyward's top executives. The emails and financial reports indicated a conspiracy to hide the true condition of the aircraft from regulatory authorities and the public. Julia knew she was on the verge of exposing a scandal that could shake the aviation industry. As the session began, Richard Hunter, visibly on edge, launched into an aggressive defense. He attacked the credibility of the whistleblowers and tried to undermine the authenticity of the documents presented. These allegations are baseless, he argued, his voice sharp. Skyward Airlines operates with the highest standards of safety and integrity. This is nothing more than a smear campaign by a desperate attorney. Julia stood up, her eyes locking with Richard's. This isn't about smearing anyone, Mr. Hunter. This is about the truth. The evidence speaks for itself. Skyward Airlines knowingly put lives at risk to save money. The judge called for order as murmurs filled the courtroom. Julia continued, Your Honor, I request to call an expert witness who can shed light on the implications of these actions. Dr. Samuel Green, a former safe. Victor Carlisle's face turned ashen as the recording played. He glanced nervously at Richard Hunter, who quickly objected, claiming the recording was obtained unlawfully. However, Julia had anticipated this and presented documentation proving the whistleblower had acted within their legal rights. The judge allowed the recording to be entered into evidence. The courtroom was silent as the implications of the recording sank in. Julia stood up, her voice steady and confident. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just about a tragic accident. It's about a corporation's deliberate choice to value profit over human lives. Skyward Airlines must be held accountable. Richard Hunter's counterarguments grew more desperate as the trial continued. He called several character witnesses to vouch for Carlisle's integrity and Skyward's commitment to safety. However, their testimonies were undermined by the overwhelming evidence of the company's malfeasance. As the day drew to a close, Julia felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The threats, the pressure, and the media scrutiny were all taking their toll. She stepped outside the courthouse for a moment of fresh air, her mind racing. The anonymous caller's threats echoed in her ears, but she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Mark approached, his face serious. Julia, there's something you need to know. We've just received another message. It's more direct this time. They know about Emily's school. Julia's heart skipped a beat. Emily, her bright and curious daughter, was her world. The thought of her being targeted was terrifying. Julia quickly called David, instructing him to pick up Emily and take her somewhere safe. As she hung up, she felt a surge of anger and resolve. The case was no longer just about justice for the victims of the crash, it was about protecting her family and standing up against the corruption and threats that sought to silence her. The next day, as the trial resumed, Julia was more determined than ever. She knew the jury was leaning in her favor, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. The final pieces of evidence and testimonies would be crucial in securing a verdict. As the court proceedings continued, Julia noticed a figure at the back of the courtroom, a woman in a dark suit, watching intently. There was something familiar about her, and as Julia tried to place her, a sudden realization struck. The woman was a private investigator known for working with large corporations in damage control. Julia's stomach turned. This was a new player, someone brought in to sway the case at the last minute. Julia's suspicions were confirmed when the woman approached her during a recess, introducing herself as Claire Reynolds. Ms. Carson, she said with a cold smile, I'm here on behalf of Skyward Airlines. We should talk. Julia bristled. There's nothing to discuss, Ms. Reynolds. The truth will come out. Reynolds leaned in closer, her smile never wavering. The truth is subjective, Ms. Carson. It's all about how it's presented. Think carefully about your next moves. As Reynolds walked away, Julia felt a chill. Skyward was playing a dangerous game, and they were bringing in the big guns. The final days of the trial would be the most challenging yet, but Julia knew she had to stay focused and vigilant. The battle for justice was reaching its climax, and Julia Carson was ready to face whatever came next, even as the threats loomed closer and the stakes grew higher. The truth was within reach, but at what cost? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial neared its conclusion. Julia Carson could feel the weight of each day pressing on her, the tension mounting as she and her team prepared for the final phase of the case. Skyward Airlines had thrown every resource at their disposal into defending themselves, but Julia's relentless pursuit of the truth had brought them to the brink. Claire Reynolds, the private investigator, had become a looming presence. Julia was acutely aware of her during the proceedings, often catching her watching intently, her expression inscrutable. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Reynolds was orchestrating something behind the scenes, possibly a last-minute strategy to derail the case. As the trial resumed, Julia introduced one of her most compelling witnesses, Dr. Stephen Reardon, an independent aviation expert. Dr. Reardon had reviewed the crash data and maintenance records and was prepared to testify about the systemic issues that plagued Skyward's fleet. His findings were damning. He confirmed that the faulty sensors had been a known issue and that the company's decision not to address them was a significant factor in the crash. Dr. Reardon explained the technical details in a way that was clear and accessible, making it easy for the jury to understand the gravity of Skyward's negligence. The data shows that these sensors were malfunctioning in multiple aircraft, he stated. This was not an isolated incident, but a widespread issue that should have been addressed immediately. Richard Hunter, growing increasingly desperate, attempted to undermine Dr. Reardon's credibility by suggesting that his analysis was biased. However, Julia had anticipated this and had Dr. Reardon provide documentation of his independent work and credentials, effectively neutralizing the attack. As Dr. Reardon left the stand, Julia felt a small surge of hope. They had presented a strong case, and the jury seemed to be responding favorably. However, she knew that the defense still had cards to play. During a recess, Julia and Mark reviewed their final strategy. Mark handed her a file. "This just came in. It's an analysis of Skyward's financial transactions. It shows a pattern of payments to an offshore account connected to a shell company. We suspect it's related to bribes or hush money." Julia's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. "This could be the link we need to prove the cover-up. If we can tie these payments to key executives, including Victor Carlisle, it will be damning evidence of corporate malfeasance." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, tensions were high. The media had latched onto the story, painting Julia as a crusading lawyer fighting against a corrupt corporation. This portrayal, while flattering, also made her a target. Julia's phone buzzed with a message from David, informing her that private security had increased their vigilance around their home and Emily's school. Julia appreciated the support, but she knew the real battle was in the courtroom. As they returned to the session, Richard Hunter called a surprise witness, James O'Leary, a former executive at Skyward who had left the company under mysterious circumstances. O'Leary's testimony was meant to undermine the accusations against Skyward, portraying the company's actions as standard industry practice. O'Leary painted a picture of a company that was simply trying to navigate complex regulatory waters, not one that was deliberately cutting corners. Skyward did everything by the book, he insisted. The issues with the sensors were being addressed, and there was no intentional negligence. Julia listened carefully, sensing that O'Leary was holding something back. During cross-examination, she pressed him on his departure from the company, suggesting that he had been forced out because of internal disagreements over safety practices. O'Leary became visibly uncomfortable, his responses increasingly defensive. As the questioning continued, Julia caught a glimpse of Claire Reynolds in the gallery, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Julia realized that Reynolds might have had a hand in coaching O'Leary's testimony, shaping his narrative to protect Skyward. Julia decided to take a gamble. "Mr. O'Leary," she said, her tone measured, "isn't it true that you were aware of the faulty sensors and raised concerns about them, only to be overruled by Victor Carlisle and other executives?" O'Leary hesitated, glancing at Richard Hunter, who was signaling him to object. But Julia pressed on. "Isn't it also true that you were offered a severance package contingent on signing a non-disclosure agreement, effectively silencing you about the company's internal issues?" The courtroom fell silent as O'Leary struggled to respond. His hesitation spoke volumes, and the jury was riveted. Richard Hunter quickly objected, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. During a brief recess, Julia's team scrambled to secure more concrete evidence connecting O'Leary's testimony to the offshore accounts. Mark worked furiously, cross-referencing the dates of the payments with O'Leary's severance package. It was a long shot, but if they could prove that O'Leary had been paid off to keep quiet, it would bolster their case significantly. As the court reconvened, Julia felt the weight of the trial bearing down on her. She knew that Skyward was pulling every string, using every resource to protect themselves. The presence of Claire Reynolds only confirmed that they were willing to play dirty. Julia stood and addressed the court, summarizing the evidence. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have seen here is a pattern of negligence, concealment, and corporate malfeasance. The evidence shows that Skyward Airlines prioritized profits over safety, resulting in a tragedy that could have been prevented. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, landing on Victor Carlyle. The victims and their families deserve justice. This trial is not just about compensation, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those responsible are held to account and that such a tragedy never happens again. As she concluded, Julia felt a sense of exhaustion mixed with hope. The trial was coming to a close, and the outcome was uncertain. She had done everything she could, but she knew that the final decision rested with the jury. The judge announced that the jury would begin deliberations the next day. As the courtroom emptied, Julia watched Victor Carlyle and Richard Hunter confer with Claire Reynolds. They were clearly strategizing for a potential appeal, indicating that they were preparing for the possibility of losing the case. Julia left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras. She answered a few questions, maintaining her composure despite the whirlwind around her. As she made her way to her car, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from the anonymous caller: "This isn't over. You don't know who you're dealing with." Julia's resolve hardened. She was determined to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The threats, the intimidation, and the pressure were all part of a larger battle, a battle for justice, truth, and the safety of countless passengers who trusted Skyward Airlines. As she drove away, Julia couldn't help but think about the families of the victims, the lives lost, and the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. The next day would bring the jury's verdict, but regardless of the outcome, Julia knew she had stood up against a powerful adversary and had done everything in her power to seek justice. The final chapter of the trial was yet to be written, and Julia was prepared for whatever came next. The truth was out there, and she would continue to fight for it, for the victims, for her family, and for herself. The courthouse was abuzz with activity as the jury returned to deliver their verdict. The room was packed with journalists, family members of the victims, and onlookers, all eager to hear the outcome of the high-stakes trial. Julia Carson stood with her team, a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning within her. Across the room, Richard Hunter and Victor Carlyle sat, their expressions inscrutable. Claire Reynolds was absent, a detail that didn't escape Julia's notice. Perhaps she had anticipated the outcome. The jury filed in, and the foreman handed the verdict slip to Judge Marlowe. The judge read through it, his face revealing nothing. He handed the slip back and nodded for the foreman to announce the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Skyward Airlines, liable for gross negligence and corporate misconduct," the foreman declared. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced as the foreman continued. "We award the plaintiffs compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of $250 million. Julia felt a rush of relief and triumph. The verdict was a resounding victory, not just for the families of the victims, but for accountability and justice. The families, seated in the gallery, hugged each other, some crying tears of relief. Julia turned to her team, sharing smiles and quiet words of congratulations. Richard Hunter, visibly shaken, stood to make a statement. "We intend to appeal this decision," he announced, his voice tight. "We believe the evidence was misinterpreted and that our client will ultimately be vindicated." Julia expected as much. An appeal was standard in such cases, especially with such high stakes. As the courtroom began to clear, she shook hands with her clients, offering them words of comfort and assurance that they would continue to fight if necessary. Outside, the media swarmed, eager for statements. Julia addressed them briefly, emphasizing the importance of the verdict and the need for corporate accountability. She was careful not to gloat, knowing the battle wasn't entirely over yet. As Julia left the courthouse, her phone rang. It was David, calling to congratulate her. "You did it, Julia. We're so proud of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Julia smiled, her heart warming at the sound of her husband's voice. "Thanks, David. It was a team effort, but I'm glad we got justice for the families." David's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "We need to talk about the threats. I know today is a victory, but we can't let our guard down." Julia nodded, her expression sobering. The anonymous threats had been a constant shadow over the trial, and the victory might provoke further backlash. "You're right. We'll keep the security measures in place for now." That evening, Julia returned to her office to wrap up some final paperwork. As she sorted through documents, Mark knocked on the door. "Julia, there's something you need to see," he said, holding out a tablet. Julia took it and saw an email from an anonymous source. It contained a list of transactions from an offshore account, implicating several Skyward executives in illegal activities, including bribery and money laundering. The account was linked to Victor Carlyle and others, confirming their worst suspicions. "This is explosive," Julia murmured, her mind racing. The evidence was clear and damning, and it provided a new avenue for legal action. But it also explained the lengths Skyward and its associates had gone to in order to protect themselves. Mark looked concerned. "What do we do with this? It's more than just negligence, it's criminal." Julia thought for a moment, weighing the implications. "We turn it over to the authorities. This isn't just about the civil case anymore, this is criminal. Carlyle and his team need to be held accountable for all of it." As they prepared to contact law enforcement, Julia couldn't help but think about the larger implications. The trial had exposed deep-seated corruption, not just within Skyward Airlines but potentially within the industry. The fight for justice was far from over, and Julia knew she would have to remain vigilant. The next morning, Julia met with federal investigators, providing them with the new evidence. The agents thanked her for her diligence and assured her that a full investigation would follow. Julia felt a sense of closure, knowing that she had done everything possible to seek justice. As she left the meeting, her phone rang. It was Claire Reynolds. Julia answered, her voice steady. "Ms. Reynolds, what can I do for you?" Reynolds' voice was cool and composed. "Congratulations on your victory, Ms. Carson. I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's just business." Julia bristled. "People's lives aren't just business, Ms. Reynolds. What Skyward did was criminal, and justice will be served." Reynolds chuckled softly. "Perhaps. But remember, the wheels of justice turn slowly, and not everyone involved will face consequences. Some things will remain hidden." Julia felt a surge of frustration but kept her composure. "We'll see about that. The truth has a way of coming out." After hanging up, Julia felt a mix of emotions. The trial was over, but the battle against corruption and injustice was ongoing. She had taken on a giant and won, but there were always more battles to fight. Back at home, Julia hugged Emily tightly, grateful for the support of her family. David joined them, smiling. "You've done something incredible, Julia. You've made a real difference." Julia nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "We all did. And we'll keep fighting for what's right, no matter the cost." As she looked out at the city skyline, Julia knew that this victory was just one step in a long journey. The legal battles would continue, but she was ready. With her family by her side and a renewed sense of purpose, Julia Carson was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the truth and a steadfast commitment to justice.